Hi, Benjamin. I'm so happy to have you on this podcast. It's the closing episode of season 3 of the Jury Corner sub podcast. We're so honored to have you with us. We wanted to have you on this podcast for a long time. So thanks for being with us. Welcome, Benjamin.
Thank you so much. Acharon Chaviv. So I'm very flattered that you chose me for the last one.
It's very special. So this podcast is for jury collectors, jury connoisseurs, people who love jewelry, who love diamonds. And you have had such a rich life in the jewelry industry, in the diamond industry. You've written books. You've been dealing with beautiful stones. So where do we start with you, Benjamin? We have so much to say. So tell me first, how did you start in this industry that we all love so much?
I had a conversation with my father. I said, Dad, I want to be a novelist, a writer. And he said, well, you could write about jewelry. I said, Dad, it's not the same thing. I want to write novels. He said, well, but you could still write about jewelry. What about a trip to India? And I had been to Yale College and Harvard Law School and got degrees. And so I thought, okay, I'll give it a try. I went to India and I was completely overcome by the light, by the jewels I saw day after day, hour after hour. I saw fabulous gems and I joined the firm.
When was that, Benjamin?
It would have been 1973. When I came back, I said, okay, Dad, I'm sold. What should I do? He said, you should start off and take a 6-month course at the Gemological Institute of America. Now, I had heard that it was very difficult. So I was smart enough to realize that my older sister, Margot Mindich, who's a super brain, I now live in her apartment house with my wife, she could join me also. So she and I were in the GIA, and sure enough, 20 years later, I had novels. Within a year of taking the course and entering the business, I had a book that the New York Times published. And this was really an opener to me in the business.
What was your next book after that? You carried on writing about gems first, and then you moved to the life of a very special, colorful character.
Thank you. I continued writing books, and my father had only gone to the 4th grade in Europe. He was a soldier in the French army after having been born in Poland, emigrated to Paris. And because he only went to the 4th grade, he loved education. And he kept on saying, anytime you want to write books, anytime you want to read books, whatever you want to do in the business, go ahead and do it. And you'll learn. If it's a mistake, you'll learn from the mistake. If it's good, you'll feel strong. So I think of my life in the gems as friends and jewels, friends and books. But in order to write, you can't come even close. Gems are so amazing. If you have one and look at it every single day, let's say, for example, I wrote a novel called Blue, but the green had the Taj Mahal emerald on it. And I realized when it was offered to me that the way it was cut, and I recognized it as a mogul jewel, and I was friends with a person who was the head of mogul art at Harvard. He came down and saw the gem. He said, well, it was cut in a way that you push down with a diamond stylus on the emerald. And I exclaimed, but if it breaks the emerald is so soft. That's it. He said, yes, that's it. And since the cutter or the engraver would have been in a Mughal court in the 17th century, that would not have been a good day for the jeweler because he would have had to reckon with Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal. So I have a great friend who's also a great gem dealer, and it was Jesse Wolfgang. And what I was so thrilled about from a family point of view was when you interviewed Melissa, I saw Melissa in Geneva when she was a month old. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. So when you get to be 83, and if you really look through the glasses, you have your own family history. Often you see the parents and you can sometimes see the grandchildren. So here I see Melissa and Jesse active in the business. And Jesse said to me, well, if this stone is what you say it is and you're the professor, let's go together on it. And it was that friendship and that confidence. But I mean, it's a difficult thing to have a gem that you a little bit understand, but don't fully understand. I mean, there's a sentence in Job which says, Look to the earth and it will teach you. And in Job 8:12. So, what can a gem really teach you? Well, the heart of the gem is when you see it on the ground, it's a little pebble. You wouldn't pick it up. I wouldn't pick it up. But a few people would pick it up. So if one finds a rough diamond or one finds a rough emerald, for example, unless you're a real expert on rough, well, you wouldn't know what it was. So on the one hand, you have the earth. If you take that rough stone to a great cutter, and my grandfather, Gutman Gutworth HaKohen, understood rough diamonds, for example. He could look into a diamond crystal and figure out what it could become. Because just like he was able to take the rough diamond and suggest how it could be cut and made a great living at it. He was one of the really respected diamond dealers in the 20s and 30s. Then he escaped to Cuba and finally he came to America and he lived with us. I was able, with my novels, to put the story in the center, like a page of the Talmud, and then write around it a commentary, and on the right hand side, work with pictures of works of art. So you start out with the rough diamond. The earth has given you this. And then you have a great person who recognizes it, and then he gives it to a cutter, and then the cutter cuts it. My father would say, for the red stone, is this a ruby? He had no idea of what the stone was. But if I said to my father, this is a ruby, it's 3 carats, he'd say, I don't know, I don't know, $22,000. He'd hit the cost within 10%. But when I started in the business, it seemed to me like it was very strange that people seemed to agree on prices for things, but they were so arbitrary. And if you had, let's say, a ruby, you could have variations that it was worth 22,000 or 32,000 or 42,000. So from the start, I tried to write how to invest in gems that the New York Times published to teach the public and especially to teach the jewelry stores what the standards were for rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and diamonds. 50% of the people on 47th Street said, you're doing a bad thing. You're educating the customer. It's the same thing. I should separate myself from Marty Rappaport. They said to him, you're doing a bad thing by making it too clear what the price of diamonds is. But he sailed ahead, and thank God, so far it's done very well.
Did you have also life threats on you, the same way as Martin
No,
had?
no, 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 no.
That's good.
My books, everybody would say, oh my God, it's so beautiful, your novels, but it's a little complicated. So in the Far East, they called me the professor. No one understood exactly what I was saying in the novels for sure, but they are beautiful books. And in the books about the gemstones, I would say, in order to really appreciate, for example, a diamond, you have to take it by the window. And when you see the proper light, you see the return of the white light, but also at the angle, you see the splitting of the white light into colors. And that fight between the colors and the white light is what makes the diamond so extraordinary because it is a miracle. I mean, the diamonds were not created so people on 47th Street could make a good living. They were created because they teach us something incredible about a stone. And that, I wouldn't use the word magic because it's so many different levels of abilities. But once those abilities are piled up, when a person presents that stone to a loved one, the mood improves tremendously. And the person says, oh my God, this is for me. There's so much what I feel, generally speaking, is a very beautiful creation and hope. So, same thing with colored stones. To understand the difference between a Burma ruby, let's say, with a pure red, or sapphire with a pure blue, what makes the stone so beautifully blue is the internal chemicals in it. Those can be measured on a spectroscope. In the old days, in 1973, 75, 77, when I would go to India and I would buy a beautiful Burma sapphire, when it would come back to the office, I'd quick take the stone to the Museum of Modern Art. And there is a wonderful painting by Van Gogh called The Starry Night Sapphire. And just above the cypress tree, to the right of it, is this deep blue color. Now, that blue color can be measured spectroscopically as to the amount of aluminum and oxygen and the amount of iron in that color. And of course, I myself learned how to use a spectroscope in the GIA, but I wasn't using it really for each stone. What I was doing was relying from a expert that the stone was very beautiful. I was using my taste, and it turns out that in your eye you have so many cells that can discriminate between the finest shades of blue. And the customer, too, if they relax and if they have a choice of four sapphires, they can tell you which is the best sapphire, which is the second best sapphire. Same thing for a diamond. If you put the diamonds at an angle and you look in, you can tell the E from the F. It takes a little confidence, but if you have patience, you can tell. Now, one of the problems today in the business is everybody's in a rush. So you show a diamond, and right away people say, just show me the paper. And even more so for the customer, they say, I want an F color. And my good friend, Alan Bronstein, he always says, don't look at the certificate, especially in colored diamonds where the connoisseurship is critical. Look at the stone itself. It doesn't so much matter what the certificate says. What I started to do whenever I would go to India from the beginning, I would stop in London. And in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was such a quantity of 17th century diamonds, 14th century sapphires. And I would go and I would look at the stones and I take a chance. Let's say if I saw a 14th century gold sapphire ring and it was the same shape as the stone in the Victoria and Albert Museum or in the British Museum that were in books that were written, let's say, in 1905 by Oman. And then I'd say, oh, that's 14th century gem, 13th century from the time of Marco Polo, for example. So I'd wait. And in my mind, it would be like a musée imaginaire. It would be an imaginary museum. And I would say to myself, you have to have hope that someone will show you a 14th century blue sapphire, probably mounted in England. And I did the worst thing you can do on the wholesale level, which is I didn't bargain. So the dealer would say to me, what's the matter with you? You never bargain. So I said, look, my father had a system. We had a cousin named Reinhold, and he was in the business. And he used to ask my father a lot of times to buy in the Far East for him if he couldn't go. And so my father would always bargain. So my father would add on 10% and, he'd present the prices. One time, Reinhold came in to my father and he was very upset about a family problem. He forgot to bargain. He bought. And then by the elevator, my father said to him, oh my God, you forgot to bargain. So I didn't take off the 10%. Pay me 10% less. So Hank Reinhold said to my dad, Charlie, that's my biggest fun is bargaining. So I figured out if I wasn't bargaining for each purchase, in the end, I was very reliable a buyer and I was respectful about the material and about them. And I knew where I was going. Where I was going, of course, was to form a book or a collection showing the uncut diamond, let's say in Roman times, the diamond in the 15th century when it was turned into a table cut with just the top shaved down, then the rose cut diamond. And I had, I would say, hundreds of these rings. I would sometimes sell them, but I would always try to keep the best to show. And I would take them and speak at fairs in Oklahoma City and so forth. And finally, when I had really a complete collection, the next linkage, which was to show them in a museum, because the way I imagine it is the ring as a work of art. When I started, let's say in the 70s, there wouldn't be shows of jewelry, let's say in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That was for the paintings. And yet, a 15th century ring is a work of sculpture in miniature, and the turning of the gold and the showing of the gemstone to its best effect is extraordinary. So this morning I got up and I thought to myself, well, I'm going to be interviewed. I better think of what I'm going to say. I called my 95-year-old friend, Diana Scarisbrick. She's written 50 books in the last 40 years, and she continues to read. And as I said, she's 95 years old. Whenever I would buy one of these rings in London, I would go to her house after I had bought it and say, what do you think? And then she would look at it and say, well, this is extremely interesting because it comes from a certain time in London. And she'd explain to me the culture of that time. And so she said, oh, you're being interviewed today. That's very important, Benjamin. You know, what you and I have been doing for many years. Now, if at a certain point, I said to Diana about 15 years ago, I went to Yale University. I got a wonderful education. And it turns out, surprisingly, that Elihu Yale made his fortune in India being in partnership with Sephardic people in London. He would buy the rough from the mine at Golconda. He would buy the jewels from Maharajas and from sultans and so forth. He would send them to London. He had a Rembrandt and he had a wonderful collection of jewels. When he died, this was all auctioned in London. So Diana said, what we should do is take the auction catalog and analyze the jewels, and that'll be your part, Benjamin, and talk about how Elihu Yale collected. So it would be an object based biography. So instead of saying on so and so date he was here, on so and so date he was there, let's say I went into either of your homes and I saw your rug on the floor, and let's say it's a rug from Mashhad. This would give me a feeling that somewhere in your family history, most probably, not certainly, there's a connection to Mashhad. So from the objects, and Elihu Yale had maybe 10 violins. So he clearly loved music and he loved his time in India. So we wrote a book, Diana and I had a chance to see how she really thought. So the ultimate, I would say, and then eventually the book came out and Yale was very much behind the book and would distribute it to people that gave money to Yale. And then I took the history of diamond collection that I had and I went to the Met and they said, oh, this is so interesting. And they had many of the finest pieces in the case. So I was in such a wonderful position. I could show off. I have, I think, more than 21 first cousins. So when they would come to New York, I take them to the museum. I would say, oh, you have something in the museum. This raised my status in the family tremendously, which is very important, especially as you get older. You want to be known as. And eventually I decided, well, because one of the bad things about being a collector is you overbuy because you get so excited with what you think is a masterpiece, and it takes you years to really study it and even more years to write it up. So you're, in a certain sense, in a liquid position, which is never a sound business strategy. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, if you don't buy what you think is great, you won't have time to really study it. I don't know how it happens, but if you look at something, and I'm told, for example, that if a person has a Rembrandt etching in the house and they look at it every week and then they see the fineness of Rembrandt's etching techniques and you learn more and more. I know from going, my mother and I used to go from the time I was 8, 9 to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she would hold my hand and she would point out from across the room what a Vermeer was, or the different Dutch painters. And she had grown up in the First World War when Holland was neutral and the family had moved there, and it meant a huge amount to her. So you can't be a Sassoon and buying fantastic works of art, but you go to London, go to the British Museum, you can get books now, and it's extraordinary. Like a couple of months ago in the Rappaport magazine, there were the 5 best jewelry books. And there's such technical studies of Cartier jewelry, Van Cleef jewelry, and so forth, Islamic influences on Cartier, and so forth. So you more and more see unity of the books, of the pieces themselves, but you're left with the sense. I mean, we all do what we do. We think we're doing it to make a living. We think we're doing it to raise a family. We think we're doing it. We don't know why we're doing it. We entered into it because we applied for a job and we got the job, and that's what we're doing. But if you think what you're doing and the friends that you have in what you're doing can enlighten you and you can enlighten them, then really you're accomplishing something. So, what is the meaning of that? My luck was when Gems and Jewels was published by Thames and Hudson, the publisher in London said to me, well, I can't take a chance on publishing your book, Gems and Jewels, because in order to really break even, I have to publish 3,000 copies. And I'm afraid. So you'll pay for half, I'll pay for half, and we'll go from there. So I said to him, look, I don't want these copies in my house. I mean, this is completely crazy. And there's that expression, better luck than brains. And I always felt, and I'm not bragging, I have a lot more luck than brains. The book takes off. And all of these stores in the United States, like Neiman Marcus, are ordering the book. So he suddenly is selling at a rate. And I said to him, you store my 1,500 copies in London. So he calls me up. He says, can I buy your 1,500 copies? Of course you can. Then you go into second edition. So that was my moment. It was published in Japanese, it was published in French, different languages, like the How to Buy and Sell Gems or the How to Invest in Gems. Now, my big hope is that my novels will be translated into Hebrew. And everybody tells me this is impossible. It's too expensive with the pictures and the text, and it's complicated. And my wife says to me, just be happy with what you have. Don't go into like crazy stuff. So, we're married for quite a long time. She was my high school prom date. So I figure I'm entitled to my dream. So who knows if you're in the gem business or in anything, that each year you try something new and you keep on saying to yourself, okay, you're slowing down, not so good, but you have experience, and everybody's like looking at you and saying, oh, you look pretty good for 83. I figure first you finish, and then you take the book, because how did I start really in the business? Of course, my grandfather was a noted figure, and he was by night a specialist in the Zohar and in the Talmud, and by day was the rough diamond dealer, Tuvia Gutman Gutworth. And then my dad was able to figure out how to buy gems worldwide and have partnerships and friends. Then the next step was Elihu Yale grew up, and I had a picture already of what it was like. So the gems had a way of popping up every 10 years, every 20 years. So now I say to myself, okay, what's next? And it's nice you finished the book read, but what happens if you can't sell it and if you can't find somebody? So I said to myself, well, what about your theory about the spectral colors and the comparison to the Starry Night painting? So many years ago, my uncle, Aaron Gutworth, was a diamond dealer in the Far East and in Antwerp. And one fine day in the 60s, someone came in with a blue diamond, which turned out to be the Wilsbach diamond. He knew it was beautiful, and he called up a business partner, and they bought it and they sold it. And that turned out to be, in my opinion, the most blue diamond of any blue diamond in the world. And I said to my uncle, why didn't you keep it and put it in a museum? He said, Benny, I'm different than you. You're different than me. I like business that you buy and you sell and you create things. And he was a great builder, especially in Israel. And I'm not a collector. So I thought to myself, well, this theory, I have stones that are like the yellow, for example, in the painting by Van Gogh called The Night Cafe. And it's an interior of a scene by Van Gogh. And the light is overpoweringly bright. And it's in a pool table that Van Gogh played in at the end of his life. So in the little pool table, there's a little pool ball, a billiard ball, and that corresponds to the red. It's kind of a brownish red of a Kenya ruby. Now, many years ago, I've been working with the Peabody for 25 years, and they are reopening their hall in 3 months. And I would presume that it'll really be a sensation because they have so many beautiful jewels that we've managed to get people to donate. They have a wonderful collection of dinosaur bones, everything the earth teaching, and it's open to every person who wants to go into the museum. And it's now free to all students, and anybody in Connecticut can go for free. So in that hall will be the Starry Night Sapphire. In that hall will be what's called the Van Gogh Ruby and the Van Gogh Yellow. And people will understand that across all of nature, the colors of the gemstones are actually an international language for beauty. So the colors of certain feathers that birds have meant to attract, let's say, female birds, and vice versa. Those colors often are very pure blue, green, or yellow. So throughout nature, color is incredibly important. So when we have in the Bible, let there be light, what it means is, and this brings us back to the beginning of finding the rough diamond before it's cut. And once it's cut, it's both brilliance and it's the colors. So the colors are pure prismatic colors when you tilt the stone. So that language of color that obtains and is part of gemstones is also part of identifying stars. Because if you take the spectroscope in the ultraviolet and infrared band, you get a certain signature. Now, all of creation never repeats itself. And a great diamond dealer will tell you each diamond is slightly different from every other one. And it's so true. And especially, you can't just say intense green yellow. The shade of the green yellow is quite different, and spectrally, it's different. So I think we see that there's a unity in nature, there's a unity in the gemstones. The more you look at it, the more lucky. I mean, you really got to say a prayer when you get up in the morning to think you can read books about this. And you don't have to be a diamond dealer, and you don't have to be, you can go to a museum now, the Smithsonian, and you see incredible things. And I started to say, when I started out, photography, you know, was not a patch on what it is today. And it turns out that the colored stones are more beautiful when you look at it in a microscope, because in a microscope, you see all the crystals. And for example, in my book, Gems and Jewels, I have a picture of a star sapphire, and you can see the zircon inclusion in the stone. So it's really like being in outer space. The interior of a gemstone can be said to be like a space voyage, seeing the stars, the eruption of colors on the stars. I mean, we're alive today, and you can go on the internet every day and see a new picture that was taken by this telescope, which is way above the Earth's surface and it's not obstructed by the clouds. And you see this explosion on the sun that's larger than planet Earth, or you can see a distant star long dead. I mean, we're darn lucky we're here.
I love it. That's a big perspective. We started with going into the ground with a million years or billion years diamond, and we look at the stars with you. And Benjamin, it's been so fascinating. And I love the way you put things in perspective, the color gemstones, the artwork, everything together, and the friendships along the way as well. You've taught us something. You don't need to bargain to be a successful dealer if people are listening. But Benjamin, it's been such an honor to have you on this podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your passion, your history, your fascinating stories. And I encourage everyone to go and look out for the books. Check your novel and your teaching on color gemstones and diamonds. Thank you so much, Benjamin.
It's a great pleasure. And obviously, any of these books that you would want to take pictures of, I'm happy to drop them off again in the office and so forth.